The rusted sign barely clung to its post, weathered letters spelling out Silverton Ridge, population 847, with a crooked line scratched through the numbers. Below it, someone had scrawled 0 in faded red paint. Victoria Carmichael pressed, her hand against her swollen belly as another contraction rippled through her, stronger this time. The baby wasn't supposed to come for another 3 weeks, but babies, she'd learned, rarely followed schedules. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Her Honda Civic wheezed to a stop in the middle of what had once been Main Street, steam rising from under the hood like ghostly fingers. The engine gave one final shudder before falling silent, leaving only the sound of wind whistling through. Broken windows and her own labored breathing. Victoria had never imagined she'd end up here, stranded in a place that time had forgotten. 3 days ago, she'd been living in her sister's cramped apartment in Phoenix, enduring daily lectures about responsibility and proper planning. Sarah meant well, but her pointed comments about single mothers and financial stability had grown unbearable. When Victoria discovered the letter from their great-aunt's estate lawyer mentioning a small inheritance and a cabin somewhere in the Colorado mountains, it felt like providence. The inheritance turned out to be modest, barely enough to cover gas and food for the journey, but the promise of a place of her own, even temporarily, had been too tempting to ignore. She'd packed her few belongings, withdrawn her last $200, and headed north toward the address, scribbled on the back of an envelope. Now, as she surveyed the desolate landscape around her, that decision seemed catastrophically foolish. Silverton Ridge stretched before her like a museum of abandonment. Victorian-era buildings lined both sides of the dirt road, their facades weathered to silver grey, with missing shutters hanging like broken wings. A general store sign creaked in the wind, and through its shattered windows she could see empty shelves covered in decades of dust. The pain in her abdomen intensified, and Victoria gripped the steering wheel until her knuckles went white. She needed help, but her cell phone showed no signal, hadn't shown signal for the last 40 miles. The GPS had stopped working somewhere near the Colorado border, leaving her to navigate by roadside signs and intuition. She forced herself out of the car, her legs unsteady after hours of driving. The altitude made her dizzy, and she had to lean against the hood for a moment to catch her breath. The silence was profound. No traffic, no voices, no sounds of civilization. Only wind and the distant cry of a hawk circling overhead. Victoria had grown up in cities, first Los Angeles, then Phoenix after her parents died in the accident. She'd never experienced quiet like this, the kind that seemed to press against her eardrums and make her own heartbeat sound thunderous. It was both peaceful and terrifying. The main street extended for perhaps 3 blocks before dissolving into scrubland and pine forest. Most buildings showed signs of hasty abandonment, doors left ajar, personal belongings scattered in the dust, faded photographs still hanging crooked on walls. Nature had begun its slow reclamation project. Weeds pushed through sidewalk cracks, and vines crept up the sides of structures like green fingers, trying to pull everything back into the earth. Victoria walked slowly toward what appeared to be the largest building, a 3-story structure, with Silverton Hotel carved into a stone lintel above heavy wooden doors. The doors were chained shut, but a side window had been broken, offering a glimpse into a lobby frozen in time. Velvet chairs sat beneath portraits of stern-faced men in 19th-century dress, their eyes seeming to follow her movement. Another contraction struck, stronger than before, and she had to grab the hotel's porch railing for support. Her water hadn't broken yet, but the pains were coming more frequently now. She tried to remember what she'd learned in the childbirth class she'd attended exactly twice before deciding she couldn't afford to continue. First, babies usually took their time, the instructor had said. Labour could last 12 hours or more, but Victoria had never been typical, and apparently neither was her baby. She made her way back to her car and tried the engine again. Nothing, not even a clicking sound. The temperature gauge showed red, and when she popped the hood, she could see coolant pooled beneath the radiator. Even if she could find water to refill it, she suspected the damage went deeper. The Honda had been reliable through college and her first years of teaching, but it was 12 years old and had been running on borrowed time for months. Victoria retrieved her purse and the small suitcase from the back seat, then began walking toward the far end of town. Maybe she'd find something. An old payphone, another abandoned car that might still run, or at least shelter where she could wait out whatever was about to happen to her body. The buildings grew smaller and more deteriorated as she walked. A barbershop with striped poles still standing, though the colors had faded to muted pastels. A millinery shop with headless mannequins in the window wearing elaborate Victorian hats, now decorated with spider webs. A saloon with bat-wing doors hanging from a single hinge each. At the very edge of town, she found what had once been a small church. The steeple had partially collapsed, and the wooden cross lay broken in the weeds, but the main structure seemed sound. Victoria pushed open the heavy door, which groaned on rusted hinges, and stepped inside. Dust motes danced in shafts of colored light streaming through stained glass windows that had miraculously survived whatever catastrophe had emptied this place. Wooden pews still stood in neat rows, though many were covered with debris from the damaged roof. At the front, a simple altar held the remains of what might have been flowers, now nothing but dried stems in a tarnished vase. She chose a pew near the middle and sank onto the hard wooden seat, grateful to rest. The building provided blessed relief from the sun, and despite its deteriorated condition, there was something peaceful about the space. Victoria wasn't particularly religious, but she'd always found churches comforting, the sense of sanctuary, of generations of people seeking solace within walls built for that specific purpose. As she sat there, trying to regulate her breathing and ignore the increasing frequency of contractions, Victoria noticed details that spoke to the care people had once taken with this place. Hand-carved details on the pulpit. Stained glass windows depicting not just religious scenes but local imagery, mountains, mining equipment, families in period dress. Someone had loved this church, this town, enough to invest in beauty that would outlast them. She wondered what had happened to Silverton Ridge. Ghost towns weren't uncommon in Colorado, mining booms that went bust, railroad routes that changed, economic shifts that left communities stranded. But the abandonment here seemed more recent than others she'd passed on her journey north. The cars she'd seen rusting in driveways were from the 1980s and 90s, not the early 1900s like typical mining ghost towns. Another contraction gripped her, and this time Victoria couldn't suppress a small cry. The sound echoed off the church walls, coming back to her amplified and strange. She checked her watch. The pains were now coming every 8 minutes. Still time, she told herself. Still time for someone to find her, for help to arrive, for the rational world to reassert itself over this nightmare of bad timing and mechanical failure. But as the afternoon sun began to slant through the windows, at a different angle, painting the church walls in deeper shades of amber and gold, Victoria began to accept that help might not be coming. She was alone in a dead town, with a baby determined to make its entrance into the world, whether she was ready or not. She thought about her sister Sarah, probably just getting home from work at the insurance office, making dinner for her husband, and 2 perfectly planned children. Sarah would be worried when Victoria didn't call tonight as promised, but it would be morning before she'd think to contact anyone, and even then, what could she do? Victoria had been deliberately vague about her destination, partly because she wasn't entirely sure herself where she was going. The irony wasn't lost on her that she'd driven hundreds of miles to escape judgment about her unplanned pregnancy. only to end up in a situation where she might have to deliver the baby entirely alone. She'd wanted independence, space to figure out how to be a mother without constant input from well-meaning relatives. "Be careful what you wish for," her mother used to say. Victoria stood and walked to one of the intact windows, looking out at the empty street. The light was beginning to change, taking on the golden quality that preceded sunset in high-altitude places. In a few hours, darkness would fall, and temperatures would drop. She needed to make decisions about where to spend the night, how to stay warm, what to do if labor progressed faster than expected. As she stood there planning, movement caught her eye. Far up the hillside beyond town, a thin column of smoke rose, straight into the still air. Smoke meant fire, and fire meant someone was there, someone alive in this desolate place. Victoria gripped the window frame as another contraction seized her, stronger and longer than the others. When it passed, she looked up at the smoke again. It was definitely there, definitely real. Someone was in those hills, perhaps a mile away, maybe less. But the terrain looked rough, all steep slopes and loose rock, and she was 8.5 months pregnant with a car that wouldn't start. Still, it was the first sign of life she'd encountered since arriving in Silverton Ridge. As the sun sank lower and shadows began to stretch across the abandoned town, that distant smoke began to look less like a minor curiosity and more like her only hope of survival. Victoria knew she had no choice but to attempt the climb. The contractions were coming every 6 minutes now, and darkness would fall within 2 hours. She gathered what she could carry, her purse, a water bottle, and a thin jacket, and began making her way up the rocky slope toward the source of the smoke. The terrain proved even more treacherous than it had appeared from below. Loose shale shifted under her feet with each step, and thorny scrub brush caught at her clothes. Her breathing became labored quickly in the thin mountain air, and she had to stop frequently to rest. Each pause brought the risk of another contraction hitting while she was exposed on the steep hillside. 20 minutes into the climb, she encountered the remnants of an old mining road, nothing more than 2 parallel ruts carved into the mountainside. Decades ago, the path was overgrown and washed out in places, but it provided easier footing than scrambling over loose rock. Victoria followed it upward, grateful for any advantage the terrain might offer. The smoke grew thicker as she climbed, and with it came the scent of burning pine and something else, something that smelled like cooking food. Her stomach cramped, with hunger reminding her that she hadn't eaten since a gas station sandwich that morning. The baby seemed to be demanding extra calories these days, leaving her constantly hungry despite her dwindling funds. A sharp turn in the old road revealed the source of the smoke. Tucked into a natural depression in the hillside sat a small cabin, its log walls dark with age but solid-looking. Solar panels had been mounted on the south-facing roof, and a modern chimney pipe extended upward, releasing the steady stream of smoke she'd followed. Behind the cabin, she could see the dark mouth of what was clearly a mine entrance, with rail tracks leading into the mountain and a pile of ore samples glinting in the fading light. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Victoria paused at the edge of the clearing, suddenly uncertain. The cabin looked well-maintained, clearly inhabited, but something about the isolation and the defensive positioning suggested its occupant valued privacy above all else. She'd heard stories about mountain hermits, people who'd left society behind and didn't welcome unexpected visitors. Before she could decide whether to approach or retreat, the cabin door opened, and a man stepped out. He was tall and lean, with shoulder-length dark hair streaked with premature grey and a full beard that couldn't hide the sharp angles of his face. His clothes were practical: work pants, flannel shirt, heavy boots. all showing the kind of wear that came from genuine use rather than fashion. But it was his eyes that gave Victoria pause. They were dark, intelligent, and filled with a wariness that spoke of old pain carefully guarded. For a long moment, they simply stared at each other across the clearing. Victoria felt exposed and vulnerable, acutely aware of her disheveled appearance and obvious pregnancy. The man's expression was unreadable, neither welcoming nor hostile, but clearly surprised by her presence. "You're lost," he said finally. His voice was deeper than she'd expected, with the roughened quality of someone who didn't use it often for conversation. "My car broke down in town," Victoria replied, trying to keep her voice steady. "I saw your smoke and hoped—" She was interrupted by another contraction, stronger than the previous ones, and couldn't suppress a sharp intake of breath. The man's demeanor changed instantly. He moved toward her with quick, purposeful strides, and Victoria saw something shift in his expression, a professional alertness that suggested medical training. "How far apart are they?" he asked, reaching her side as the contraction peaked. "Every 6 minutes, maybe 5 now," Victoria managed, surprised by his immediate understanding of the situation. "When's your due date?" 3 weeks from tomorrow." He studied her face intently, and Victoria had the uncomfortable sensation of being evaluated by someone who knew exactly what to look for. When the contraction passed, he gestured toward the cabin. "I'm Marcus Holloway," he said. "You need to get inside and off your feet. That baby isn't waiting for anyone's convenience." Victoria felt a wave of relief so intense it nearly brought tears to her eyes. "Victoria Carmichael, thank you. I thought I was going to have to—" She stopped, not wanting to voice her worst fears. Marcus led her toward the cabin, his hand hovering near her elbow without quite touching, ready to offer support if needed. "How long since your water broke?" "It hasn't yet." "Good. That gives us some time." He paused at the cabin door, and Victoria caught another glimpse of that carefully controlled wariness. "I should tell you, I'm not exactly set up for visitors. Haven't had company in a long time." The cabin's interior surprised Victoria with its organization and comfort. The single large room was divided into functional areas: a kitchen, along one wall, a sleeping area with a neatly made bed, a workspace with mining equipment and geological samples, and a sitting area centered around a stone fireplace where a fire crackled warmly. Books lined shelves built into every available wall space, and she caught glimpses of titles ranging from geology texts to classic literature to medical references. "Sit," Marcus instructed, indicating a sturdy wooden chair near the fire. "I'll get some things together." Victoria sank into the chair gratefully, feeling warmth seep into her bones for the first time since morning. She watched as Marcus moved efficiently around the cabin, gathering supplies from various cabinets and drawers. His movements were economical and precise, speaking of years spent in solitude where every action had purpose. "Are you a doctor?" she asked, as he assembled what looked like a basic medical kit. Marcus paused in his preparations. "I was a paramedic before, long time ago." He resumed his task without elaborating, but Victoria caught the weight behind those simple words. Before what, she wondered, but didn't push. He returned to her side with a basin of warm water, clean towels, and a collection of medical supplies that seemed surprisingly comprehensive for a mountain hermit's cabin. "I need to check your blood pressure and listen to the baby's heartbeat, if you're comfortable with that." Victoria nodded, grateful beyond words for his competent presence. As he wrapped the blood pressure cuff around her arm, she noticed his hands. They were scarred and calloused from mining work, but they moved with the gentle precision of someone trained in medical care. "Blood pressure's a little elevated, but not dangerous," he said after taking the reading. "Could be the stress of the situation or just normal pregnancy changes." He produced an old stethoscope from his kit. "This might be cold." The familiar ritual of prenatal care felt surreal in this isolated mountain cabin, but Marcus's professional demeanor helped Victoria relax. He listened to the baby's heartbeat for several minutes, moving the stethoscope to different positions. On her belly, his expression concentrated. "Strong, steady heartbeat," he announced, coiling the stethoscope. "Baby sounds healthy and active." Another contraction began building, and Victoria gripped the arms of the chair. Marcus watched her carefully, timing the duration on an old pocket watch. When it passed, he made a note in a small notebook. 4.5 minutes apart now, lasting about 45 seconds, he said. "We're definitely in active labor." Victoria felt a spike of panic. "But it's too early. The baby isn't supposed to come yet. Babies born at 37 weeks do fine," Marcus said calmly. "Technically, you're full term. This little one just decided to make an early appearance." His matter-of-fact tone helped steady Victoria's nerves. But questions multiplied in her mind. What if something goes wrong? What if there are complications? We're hours from the nearest hospital. Marcus was quiet for a moment, staring into the fire. When he spoke, his voice carried a weight that suggested personal experience with difficult situations. "I've delivered babies before in emergency situations. I have most of what we'd need here. But I won't lie to you. This isn't ideal. If you want to try to get to a hospital, we'd need to leave now, and it would mean hiking back down to your car and hoping I can get it running." Victoria considered this, but another contraction was already building. The idea of attempting the treacherous climb back down the mountain, then potentially driving for hours while in active labor, seemed impossibly daunting. "I don't think I can make that trip," she admitted. Marcus nodded as if he'd expected this answer. "Then we prepare for a home birth. I'll do everything I can to make sure both you and the baby come through this safely." As if summoned by their conversation, another contraction struck, noticeably stronger than the previous ones. Victoria found herself making a low, moaning sound, and Marcus immediately moved to her side. "Breathe through it," he coached. "Deep breaths. Don't hold your breath or fight it. Your body knows what to do." His calm presence helped Victoria focus on breathing rather than panic. When the contraction passed, she realized she felt marginally better than she had during the previous ones. "How do you know so much about childbirth?" she asked. Marcus returned to his preparations, avoiding her eyes. "I told you I was a paramedic. We responded to everything. Car accidents, medical emergencies, births that couldn't wait for the hospital." There was more to the story, Victoria sensed, but something in his expression warned her not to probe deeper. Instead, she focused on the practical question that had been nagging at her. "Why are you living up here alone? This is pretty extreme isolation, even for Colorado." Marcus paused in organizing his supplies, and Victoria saw his jaw tighten slightly. "I have my reasons." The dismissive tone might have offended her under other circumstances, but Victoria was beginning to understand that whatever had driven Marcus to this mountain had been profound enough to make him abandon his previous life entirely. The medical training, the well-stocked cabin, the defensive positioning, all of it spoke to someone who'd been prepared for various emergencies, but hoped never to use those preparations. "I'm sorry," she said quietly. "I didn't mean to pry. I'm just grateful you're here." Marcus looked at her then, and she saw something soften in his expression. "You don't need to apologize. It's just, I'm not used to explaining myself to anyone anymore." Another contraction was building, and Victoria could feel the intensity increasing. She gripped the chair arms and tried to remember the breathing techniques from her abbreviated childbirth class. Marcus moved behind her and placed his hands gently on her shoulders. "Lean forward slightly," he instructed. "Sometimes changing position helps with the pain." The adjustment did help, and Victoria found herself grateful not just for Marcus's medical knowledge, but for his calm presence. There was something steadying about his quiet competence, the way he seemed to anticipate what she needed before she knew it herself. "How long have you been living up here?" she asked when the contraction passed, needing distraction from the growing intensity of her labor. 7 years, Marcus replied, returning to his preparations. Came up here after... He stopped, then shook his head. After my life changed. Victoria wanted to ask more, but another contraction was already beginning, stronger and longer than any she'd experienced. This time, she couldn't suppress a cry of pain, and Marcus was immediately at her side, offering support and encouragement. As the contraction peaked, Victoria realized with startling clarity that this baby was coming tonight, in this remote cabin, with only a mysterious hermit to help her through the most challenging experience of her life. As the evening deepened, and Victoria's contractions intensified, Marcus transformed his cabin into an impromptu delivery room, with the efficiency of someone who'd faced medical emergencies before. He moved his mining equipment to one corner, spread clean sheets over his bed, and arranged towels, medical supplies, and a basin of sterilized water within easy reach. "The contractions are 3 minutes apart now," he announced after timing several cycles. "We need to get you more comfortable and check your progress." Victoria had been trying to walk around the cabin between contractions, as Marcus had suggested, but the pain was becoming overwhelming. Each wave felt like being caught in a vice that tightened relentlessly before finally releasing her to gasp for air. "I don't think I can do this," she whispered during a brief respite. Fear had crept into her voice despite her efforts to stay calm. Marcus knelt beside the chair where she'd collapsed after the latest contraction. "Victoria, look at me." His dark eyes were steady, filled with a quiet confidence that helped anchor her spiraling panic. "Women have been having babies for thousands of years, in caves and huts and places far less prepared than this. Your body knows exactly what to do. I'm here to help, but you're the one doing the real work." "But what if something goes wrong? What if the baby—" "Then we handle it," Marcus said firmly. "One step at a time. Right now everything is progressing normally. The baby's heartbeat is strong. Your vital signs are stable, and you're doing exactly what you need to do." His calm certainty helped Victoria regain some composure, but she couldn't shake the surreal quality of the situation. 12 hours ago, she'd been driving through Colorado farmland, worried about finding her great-aunt's cabin and figuring out her future as a single mother. Now, she was about to give birth in a stranger's mountain hideaway, attended by a man whose background remained largely mysterious. "Can you tell me something about yourself?" she asked, as another contraction began building. "I need something to focus on besides the pain." Marcus hesitated, then began speaking in measured tones. "I grew up in Denver. My father was a geologist, worked for mining companies throughout the West. He taught me about rocks and minerals before I could properly read." His voice took on a distant quality, as if he were reaching back through years of carefully buried memories. "I became a paramedic because I wanted to help people directly, immediately. There's something satisfying about being the person who shows up when everything's gone wrong." The contraction peaked, and Victoria found Marcus's steady voice helped. Her breathed through it more effectively than pure willpower alone. "What made you leave?" She managed when she could speak again. Marcus's expression shuttered, and Victoria saw him retreat behind the emotional walls he'd constructed. "Sometimes helping people isn't enough," he said quietly. "Sometimes you fail, and the failure changes everything." Before Victoria could respond, another contraction began, stronger and longer than any previous one. This time she felt a sudden rush of warm fluid, and Marcus immediately moved into action. "Your water just broke," he announced, grabbing towels to manage the mess. "That means we're getting close. I need to check how dilated you are." The examination confirmed what Victoria's body was already telling her. The baby was coming soon, whether she felt ready or not. Marcus helped her onto the bed he'd prepared, arranging pillows to support her back and keep her as comfortable. As possible. 8 centimeters, he reported. When you reach 10, you'll start feeling the urge to push. That could be anywhere from 30 minutes to a few hours, depending on how quickly things progress. Victoria nodded, trying to process this information between waves of pain that seemed to be building toward some inevitable crescendo. The contractions were nearly continuous now, with barely a minute of relief between them. Marcus settled into the rhythm of labor coaching with a competence that spoke of extensive experience. He monitored Victoria's blood pressure regularly, listened to the baby's heartbeat after each contraction, and offered steady encouragement when the pain threatened to overwhelm her resolve. "Tell me about the baby's father," he said during one of the brief interludes, clearly trying to provide distraction. Victoria grimaced, and not just from physical discomfort. "David, we were together for 2 years, talked about marriage, the whole domestic fantasy. When I told him about the pregnancy, he said he wasn't ready for that kind of responsibility. Packed his things and moved to Seattle within a week. His loss," Marcus said simply, adjusting the pillows behind her back. "That's what my sister keeps saying, but it doesn't make single parenthood any less terrifying." Victoria paused as another contraction began. "I'm a second-grade teacher. Was a second-grade teacher. I had to quit when the pregnancy started showing, because the private school where I worked had moral clauses in their contracts. Unwed mothers didn't fit their family values image." Marcus's jaw tightened, with what looked like anger on her behalf. "Sounds like a place you're better off leaving behind." "Maybe, but it doesn't solve the practical problems. I've been living with my sister Sarah and her family, but that was always meant to be temporary. Sarah means well, but she has very definite opinions about how I should handle everything. When I found out about this inheritance from our great-aunt, it seemed like a sign that I could make a fresh start somewhere." "What kind of inheritance?" "A cabin somewhere in these mountains, according to the lawyer's letter. I was driving up to find it when my car broke down." Victoria managed a weak laugh. "Seemed like such a reasonable plan when I left Phoenix this morning." Another contraction struck before Marcus could respond, and this one felt different, deeper, more urgent. Victoria heard herself making sounds she'd never made before, primal vocalizations that seemed to come from some ancestral part of her. "Brain." "That's normal," Marcus assured her, reading the alarm in her expression. "Your body is doing exactly what it needs to do. Don't fight the sounds. They actually help with pain management." The contractions continued their relentless progression, each one stronger and longer than the last. Marcus remained constantly attentive, checking the baby's position, monitoring Victoria's vital signs, and offering steady encouragement. But Victoria could see the concentration in his expression intensifying, and she began to worry that complications were developing. "Is everything okay?" she asked during a brief respite. "You look concerned." Marcus met her eyes directly. "The baby is in a slightly unusual position, not dangerous, but it might make delivery more challenging. I may need to help guide the baby out when the time comes." Fear spiked through Victoria's exhaustion. "What does that mean?" "It means I'll need to be more hands-on during the actual delivery. I've done it before, but I want you to understand what might be necessary." Before Victoria could ask for more details, the most intense contraction yet seized her body. This time, along with the familiar tightening sensation, she felt an overwhelming urge to push, as if every muscle in her core was demanding she bear down with all her strength. "I need to push," she gasped. Marcus quickly examined her again. "You're fully dilated. When the next contraction comes, go ahead and push, but listen to my instructions. We need to work together to make sure the baby comes out safely." The next few minutes passed in a blur of intense physical sensation, and Marcus's calm, authoritative voice guiding her through each push. Victoria discovered reserves of strength she hadn't known she possessed, driven by an instinct older than conscious. "Thought, I can see the head." Marcus announced during one of the brief pauses. "Dark hair just like yours. A few more pushes and we'll have a baby." The encouragement helped Victoria summon energy for the final phase of labor. With Marcus's guidance, she pushed through 3 more contractions, feeling the baby's progress with each effort. "Stop pushing for a moment," Marcus instructed suddenly, his voice taking on an urgent quality. "The cord is around the baby's neck. I need to slip it over the head before you push again." Victoria froze, terror flooding through her. "Is the baby—" "The baby's fine," Marcus said firmly, his hands working with practiced precision. "This happens in about 20% of births. I just need to— there." His voice carried relief. "The cord's clear. With the next contraction, give me everything you've got." Victoria bore down with desperate intensity, and suddenly the baby's head was fully out, followed quickly by the shoulders and the rest of the small body in a rush of fluid and blood. Marcus caught the baby expertly, immediately checking the airway and breathing. For a terrifying moment, the cabin was silent except for Victoria's exhausted breathing. Then a thin, indignant wail filled the air, and Victoria felt her heart restart after what felt like an eternity of suspended animation. "You have a daughter," Marcus announced, his voice thick with emotion Victoria hadn't expected. "She's beautiful, and she's mad as hell about being evicted from her comfortable home." Tears streamed down Victoria's face as Marcus placed the baby on her chest. The tiny girl, still slippery and covered in vernix, but undeniably perfect. The baby's cries gentled as she made contact with her mother's warm skin, and Victoria felt a love so intense it nearly overwhelmed her already overloaded emotional system. "She's so small," Victoria whispered, afraid to move for fear of disturbing the miracle in her arms. 5 pounds, maybe 5.5, Marcus estimated, gently cleaning the baby with soft towels. "Small, but healthy. Her color is good, her breathing is strong, and she's obviously got healthy lungs." As Marcus worked to deliver the placenta and handle the medical aftermath of birth, Victoria studied her daughter's face. The baby had dark hair, as Marcus had noted, and when she briefly opened her eyes, they were the deep blue that all newborns shared. Her features were delicate but well-formed, with tiny, perfect fingers that grasped reflexively at anything that touched her palm. "What will you name her?" Marcus asked as he cleaned up the medical supplies, giving Victoria privacy to begin nursing. Victoria considered the question, looking around the cabin that had become an unlikely sanctuary. "I was thinking maybe Hope, but that seems too obvious." Given the circumstances, she studied the baby's face, searching for inspiration. "Grace, her name is Grace." Marcus smiled for the first time since Victoria had met him, and the expression transformed his entire face. "Grace Carmichael. That's a strong name for a girl who decided to make her entrance in unusual circumstances." As the immediate drama of birth settled into the quieter work of new motherhood, Victoria began to grasp the magnitude of what had just occurred. She'd given birth in a stranger's cabin, miles from civilization, attended by a mysterious hermit whose own story remained largely untold. But somehow, everything had worked out. Grace was healthy, Victoria had survived the delivery, and they were both safe in this unlikely refuge. Outside, full darkness had fallen over the mountains, and Victoria could hear the wind picking up, rattling the cabin's windows. But inside, warmed by the fire and the overwhelming reality of new life, she felt a peace she hadn't experienced in months. Victoria woke to the sound of chopping wood and baby Grace's soft whimpers against her chest. Pale morning light filtered through the cabin's windows, and she could smell coffee brewing and something that might have been pancakes cooking on the wood stove. For a moment, the domestic normalcy felt so foreign after months of uncertainty that she wondered if she was still dreaming. Marcus appeared in her field of vision, carrying a steaming mug and moving with the quiet efficiency she was beginning to recognize as his default mode. "How are you feeling?" he asked, setting the coffee within her reach. "Sore, exhausted, but oddly good," Victoria replied honestly. Grace had nursed successfully several times during the night, and despite the uncomfortable sleeping arrangements, both mother and baby seemed to be thriving. "Thank you for everything you did last night. I don't know how to properly express what it means." Marcus brushed aside her gratitude with visible discomfort. "Anyone would have helped." "No, they wouldn't have," Victoria said firmly. "And most people wouldn't have been able to help effectively. You saved both our lives." Something flickered across Marcus's expression. Pain, perhaps, or old guilt. He turned away to tend the fire rather than respond, but Victoria was learning to read the subtle signs of his emotional retreat. Grace stirred and began making the hungry sounds that Victoria was already learning to interpret. As she adjusted her position to nurse, Marcus discreetly moved to the kitchen area, giving her privacy while maintaining conversation. "I've been thinking about your situation," he said, flipping what were indeed pancakes on a cast-iron griddle. "Your car is going to need significant work, new radiator at minimum, possibly engine damage. Even if we could get parts up here, which we can't, you're looking at weeks of repair time." Victoria had been dreading this conversation. In the euphoria of Grace's safe arrival, she'd temporarily pushed aside the practical problems that had stranded her in Silverton Ridge. "What are my options? I could hike down to town and try to get your car running well enough to make it to a service station. There's a mechanic in Millbrook about 40 miles south, but that's assuming the damage isn't too severe. And if it is," Marcus paused in his cooking, "then we'd need to call for a tow truck, which means explaining why there's an abandoned car in a ghost town and where you've been for the past few days." Victoria sensed there were complications he wasn't mentioning. "You don't want outsiders coming up here." "I value my privacy," Marcus said carefully. "There are reasons I chose this particular location for its isolation." Grace finished nursing and seemed content to doze against Victoria's shoulder. The morning quiet felt peaceful, almost deceptively normal, but Victoria knew they were discussing the end of whatever sanctuary she'd found in Marcus's mountain retreat. "There's something else," Marcus continued, sliding pancakes onto a plate. "I went through your car last night to get your belongings. Found the paperwork about your inheritance." Victoria felt heat rise in her cheeks. She'd forgotten about the legal documents scattered across her passenger seat. "I wasn't snooping around your property, if that's what you're thinking. That's not what concerns me." Marcus brought her the plate of food, and Victoria realized she was ravenously hungry. "Your great-aunt was Eleanor Carmichael." The name meant nothing to Victoria beyond the signature on the inheritance letter. "Did you know her?" Marcus was quiet for a long moment, staring into his coffee cup as if weighing how much to reveal. "Eleanor was my closest neighbor for the first 3 years I lived up here. Her cabin is about 2 miles north, higher up the mountain. She was unusual." "Unusual how?" "Eleanor came to these mountains in the 1960s, back when the mining town was still partially inhabited. She was running from something, never said what, but it was clear she wanted to disappear from whatever life she'd left behind. She bought the cabin and a small mining claim, learned to live completely off the grid." Victoria tried to reconcile this description with her family's vague memories of great-aunt Eleanor. "My mother mentioned her a few times, but only to say she was the black sheep of the family who'd gone to live like a hermit in Colorado." "Eleanor was brilliant," Marcus continued. "Self-taught geologist, expert in medicinal plants, could fix anything mechanical, but she was also fiercely protective of her privacy and suspicious of anyone connected to her old life." "What happened to her?" "She died about 4 years ago. Heart attack, I think, though I didn't find her until nearly a week later. I buried her up near her cabin, said what words I could." Marcus's voice carried genuine grief. "She was the closest Good thing I had to a friend up here. Victoria absorbed this information while mechanically eating the surprisingly good pancakes. The coincidence of ending up in the care of her great-aunt's only friend seemed too strange to be random chance. Did she ever mention family? Only to say she'd cut all ties when she came to the mountains. She seemed to regret it, especially in her later years, but she was too proud to reach out. Marcus studied Victoria's face. She would have been fascinated. To meet you. You have her eyes. The observation touched something deep in Victoria's chest. She'd grown up feeling disconnected from her extended family, especially after her parents' death. The idea that she shared physical traits with this mysterious great-aunt created an unexpected sense of belonging. Can you show me her cabin? Marcus hesitated. It's a difficult hike, especially for someone who just gave birth, and it's been abandoned for 4 years. Might not be safe. I need to see it, Victoria said with sudden conviction. It's mine now, according to the inheritance, and papers, and maybe it could be a place for Grace and me to start over. Victoria, you're talking about living completely off the grid, miles from medical care, schools, other people. It's not a life most people can handle, especially not with a newborn. Most people haven't just given birth in a hermit's cabin and survived, Victoria pointed out. Besides, what are my alternatives? Go back to Phoenix and live on my sisters. Charity indefinitely? Try to find work as a single mother with no references because my last employer fired me for moral reasons? Marcus fell silent, and Victoria could see him wrestling with competing impulses. Part of him clearly wanted to discourage her from staying, to maintain the isolation he'd carefully constructed. But another part seemed to understand her desperation for a fresh start. If you're serious about this, he said finally, you'd need to understand what you're getting into. Mountain winters are brutal. Supply runs happen maybe once a month, weather permitting. Medical emergencies require helicopter evacuation if weather allows. It's a hard life, even for people prepared for it. But Eleanor managed it. Eleanor had decades to learn mountain survival. She made mistakes that could have killed her, especially in the early years, and she didn't have a baby to consider. Grace stirred against Victoria's shoulder, making soft, contented sounds that somehow strengthened Victoria's resolve. What if I had help learning? What if someone could teach me what I need to know? Marcus met her eyes, and Victoria saw him realize where her questions were leading. Victoria? You know these mountains better than anyone. You understood Eleanor's systems, her way of living. If anyone could help me figure out how to make this work, it would be you. I'm not a teacher. I chose this life specifically to avoid responsibility for anyone else's well-being. Victoria heard the pain behind his practical objections. What happened, Marcus? What made you run to these mountains? For a moment she thought he wouldn't answer. His jaw tightened, and she could see him rebuilding the emotional walls that her question had threatened. But then, perhaps because of the intimacy of the past 24 hours, perhaps because Grace's presence had somehow changed the dynamic between them, he began to speak. I was married, he said quietly. Rebecca. We had twin boys, Jake and Sam. They were 4 years old. His voice caught slightly on their names, and Victoria felt her heart clench in anticipation of tragedy. There was an accident on Highway 6, just outside of Golden. Multi-car pile-up in a snowstorm. I was the first paramedic on scene. Marcus stared at the fire as he spoke, his voice taking on the flat, clinical tone of someone reciting facts to avoid drowning in emotion. 18 vehicles involved, multiple casualties. I was triaging victims, trying to prioritize who needed immediate attention. Victoria waited, Grace sleeping peacefully against her chest, sensing that Marcus needed to tell this story at his own pace. I found them in the third car. I checked. Rebecca was unconscious but breathing. The boys were He stopped, struggling with words that had clearly been locked away for years. They were trapped in their car seats. I could hear them crying, calling for Daddy. Oh, Marcus, I had to choose, he continued, his voice barely above a whisper. There was a woman in another car who was bleeding out, would die if I didn't get to her immediately. And my family was trapped but seemed stable, conscious, talking. I made the professional choice. I went to save the stranger first. Victoria felt tears streaming down her face as she began to understand the magnitude of his guilt. By the time I got back to their car, a secondary collision had pushed their vehicle over the embankment. They fell 60 feet down into the canyon. Marcus's hands were shaking now, and Victoria wanted desperately to comfort him, but didn't dare interrupt. Rebecca died on impact. Jake died in the ambulance. Sam lived for 3 days in the ICU before his injuries, before we lost him too. The silence that followed was profound, filled with years of carefully contained grief and self-recrimination. Victoria finally found her voice. Marcus, you couldn't have known what would happen. You made the right choice with the information. You had, did I? His laugh was bitter, hollow. Or did I choose to save a stranger instead of my own children because that's what my training told me to do? Because I was more paramedic than father in that moment? You were both. You were trying to save everyone. The woman I treated first survived, made a full recovery, went home to her family. Sometimes I wonder if she ever thinks about the cost of her life. Marcus wiped his eyes roughly with the back of his hand. I couldn't stay in Denver after that. Couldn't keep doing the job, couldn't face the empty house, couldn't stand the sympathy in everyone's eyes. So I came here to a place where no one needed saving, where I couldn't fail anyone else. Victoria understood now why Marcus had seemed so conflicted about helping her, why her gratitude made him uncomfortable. In his mind, every successful intervention was weighed against the one that had mattered most, and where he believed he'd failed catastrophically. But you didn't fail last night, she said gently. You saved Grace and me both. That has to count for something. Marcus looked at her then, and Victoria saw a man who'd been carrying impossible guilt for 7 years, who'd built his entire existence around avoiding the possibility of caring enough about someone to fail them again. I can't be responsible for you and the baby, he said finally. I can't risk. Then don't be responsible for us, Victoria interrupted. Just teach us how to be responsible for ourselves. 3 days later, Victoria found herself hiking up an even steeper mountain trail, Grace strapped securely to her chest in an improvised carrier Marcus had fashioned from rope and canvas. Her body protested every step, but determination drove her forward. She needed to see Eleanor's cabin, needed to understand what her inheritance actually meant. Marcus moved ahead of her with practiced ease, pausing frequently to let her catch up and check on both mother and baby. He'd been reluctant to make this trip so soon after Grace's birth, but Victoria's insistence had finally worn down his resistance. There, he said, pointing through a break in the pine trees. Eleanor's place. The cabin that came into view was larger than Marcus's, built from local stone rather than logs, and positioned to take advantage of spectacular mountain views. Solar panels covered the south-facing roof, and Victoria could see a sophisticated water collection system that channeled snowmelt and rainwater into holding tanks. A substantial garden area, now overgrown with weeds, stretched across a natural terrace below the cabin. She built all this herself? Victoria asked, impressed. Despite the structure's obvious neglect, most of it, Eleanor was incredibly resourceful. She started with a basic mining shack and expanded it over decades into something approaching luxury by mountain standards. As they approached the cabin, Victoria could see evidence of Eleanor's engineering skills everywhere. Wind vanes and weather monitoring equipment dotted the property, A small workshop building housed what appeared to be a sophisticated metalworking setup. Even a greenhouse, its glass panels clouded with age but still intact, suggested Eleanor had found ways to extend her growing season. The cabin's front door was secured with a heavy padlock, but Marcus produced a key from his pocket. Eleanor gave me this years ago, asked me to check on the place if anything happened to her. The interior took Victoria's breath away. Instead of the rough, utilitarian space she'd expected, Eleanor had created a warm, comfortable home that rivaled anything she'd seen in architecture magazines. Exposed stone walls were lined with built-in shelving that held hundreds of books. A massive stone fireplace dominated one wall, flanked by comfortable reading chairs. The kitchen was compact but well-designed, with handcrafted cabinetry and modern appliances powered by the solar system. "This is incredible," Victoria whispered, turning slowly to take in every detail. She lived here alone for 50 years. Eleanor wasn't hiding from civilization, Marcus explained, testing light switches and finding that the solar system still functioned. She was creating her own version of it. "Look at this." He led Victoria to a wall covered with detailed maps, weather charts, and what appeared to be decades of careful record-keeping. Eleanor had documented everything: temperature patterns, wildlife migration routes, optimal planting times, mechanical maintenance schedules for every system in the cabin. "She turned mountain living into a science," Victoria said, studying the meticulous records. "This isn't survival, it's mastery." Grace began fussing, and Victoria settled into one of Eleanor's reading chairs to nurse her. The baby seemed content in the new environment, and Victoria found herself imagining what it would be like to raise a child in this extraordinary place. Marcus disappeared into other parts of the cabin, checking systems and opening windows to air out the musty interior. When he returned, his expression was thoughtful. "The solar array is still functional, though it needs cleaning and some panel replacement. The water system is intact. The propane tanks are nearly full. Eleanor built this place to run itself, and it's been doing exactly that." "What about food storage, supplies?" "Come see." Marcus led her down a set of stone steps to a root cellar that had been carved directly into the mountain. The space was cool and dry, with stone shelves holding dozens of mason jars filled with preserved foods. A chest freezer hummed quietly. In one corner, powered by the solar system and still maintaining temperature, Eleanor canned everything, Marcus explained, holding up jars of what appeared to be vegetables, fruits, and prepared meals. She had a system for preserving meat, fish, even dairy products. This cellar could feed someone for months. Victoria studied the labels on the jars, all written in Eleanor's precise handwriting, with dates and contents clearly marked. Some were recent, suggesting Eleanor had been preparing for winter even in her final year. "She really did think of everything," Victoria murmured. "Eleanor learned from experience. She told me about her first winter here, when she nearly starved because she didn't understand how to prepare for mountain isolation. She never made that mistake again." They spent the rest of the morning exploring the cabin systems. Eleanor had installed a sophisticated water filtration setup that could handle any source, from mountain streams to collected rainwater. A wood-burning stove provided backup heat, with a carefully managed woodpile that Marcus estimated would last through a harsh winter. The workshop contained tools for everything from basic carpentry to complex electronics repair. "I had no idea," Victoria said, as they sat on Eleanor's front porch, Grace sleeping peacefully in her arms. "When I inherited this place, I thought I was getting a rustic cabin that might need significant work. This is like inheriting a small, self-sufficient city." Marcus was quiet, studying the mountain landscape spread out below them. "Eleanor spent decades perfecting this setup. She made mistakes, learned from them, and built something remarkable, but it took her a lifetime to get here." Victoria heard the warning in his voice. You're saying I couldn't learn to manage all this. I'm saying it's not something you learn in a few weeks or months. Eleanor nearly died several times in her early years here, and she didn't have a baby to consider. But she did it alone. I wouldn't be alone. Marcus turned to look at her, and Victoria saw that familiar conflict in his expression, the part of him that wanted to help warring with the part that feared taking responsibility for another person's survival. Victoria, what you're contemplating isn't just challenging, it's dangerous. One mistake with the heating system in winter could be fatal. Problems with water purification could kill you and the baby. A medical emergency with no way to reach help. Eleanor managed all those risks. Eleanor was 25 when she came here, single, with no dependents. She could afford to make mistakes that only affected her. You have Grace to think about. Victoria looked down at her sleeping daughter, considering Marcus's words. He was right about the risks, but he didn't understand the impossibility of her alternatives. "What if I went back to Phoenix?" she asked quietly. "I'd be dependent on my sisters. Charity indefinitely. Sarah made it clear I'm welcome, as long as I follow her rules, live according to her timeline for getting my life together. I'd have to find work, but who's going to hire a single mother with a newborn and no current references? Daycare costs would eat up most of any salary I could earn. There are programs, assistance for single mothers. I've looked into them. The waiting lists are years long, and the requirements are designed to keep people dependent on the system rather than helping them become self-sufficient." Victoria's voice carried frustration built up over months of researching impossible options. "At least here I'd have a chance to build something real for Grace, a home that's truly ours, a life that isn't subject to other people's approval or judgment." Marcus was quiet for a long moment, and Victoria could see him weighing her arguments against his own fears. "If you were serious about this," he said finally, "and I'm not saying you should be, but if you were, you'd need to start with the basics. Learn to operate every system in this cabin flawlessly. Understand mountain weather patterns well enough to predict dangerous conditions. Develop the physical skills to handle repairs and maintenance. Build up food stores for at least 6 months. Of isolation, how long would that take? Depends on how fast you learn and how much help you have. Eleanor took years to master everything, but she was starting from scratch, with proper instruction." Marcus paused, clearly reluctant to continue. "Down this path, maybe a year of intensive training, if you had someone to guide you." Victoria felt a spark of hope. "Someone like you?" "I didn't say that. But you could teach me. You know these mountains, you understand Eleanor's systems, you have medical training for emergencies. Victoria, I've explained why I can't take responsibility for you and the baby. Then don't take responsibility for us. Take responsibility for teaching us to be responsible for ourselves." Victoria shifted Grace to her other arm, choosing her words carefully. "You said Eleanor was your friend. What would she think of you? Refusing to help her great-niece learn to carry on what she built?" Marcus flinched as if she'd struck him. "That's not fair, isn't it? Eleanor spent 50 years creating this place, perfecting these systems. She preserved food, maintained equipment, and documented everything. Why would she do all that if she didn't hope someone would eventually carry on her work? She never mentioned wanting a family to inherit, because she thought she'd burn those bridges permanently. But she kept everything ready, Marcus. The food stores, the maintenance records, the detailed instructions. She built this place to outlast her, to serve whoever came next." Grace stirred and opened her eyes, looking around with the unfocused gaze of a newborn. Victoria felt a surge of protectiveness and determination. "I'm not asking you to take care of us," she said firmly. "I'm asking you to teach us to take care of ourselves. There's a difference." Marcus stared out at the mountains, and Victoria could see him wrestling with the decision. Finally, he spoke without looking at her. "If I agreed to this, and I'm not saying I will, but if I did, there would be conditions. You'd have to prove You could handle each system before moving on to the next. Any sign that you or the baby were in danger, and the arrangement ends immediately. You'd have to commit to staying through at least one full winter, because that's when you'd really learn whether you could handle this life. Victoria felt her heart racing. And if I proved I could handle it, then you'd be on your own. I'd go back to my mountain, and you'd carry on Eleanor's legacy here. The thought of eventual solitude should have been terrifying, but instead, Victoria felt a deep sense of rightness. She looked around at Eleanor's carefully crafted sanctuary, imagining Grace growing up with these mountains as her playground, learning to be self-sufficient and confident in ways city children never could. "I want to try," she said simply. Marcus finally looked at her, and Victoria saw something shift in his expression. Not acceptance exactly, but a reluctant acknowledgement that her determination might be stronger than his reservations. "We'll start with the basics," he said quietly. "Water, heat, power. If you can master those systems reliably, we'll move on to food preservation and storage. If you're still determined after that, we'll tackle the harder skills, weather prediction, emergency protocols, equipment repair. And if I can learn all of that?" Marcus was quiet for a long moment, looking at Grace sleeping peacefully in Victoria's arms. "Then maybe Eleanor's legacy will live on after all." The next 2 weeks established a routine that neither Victoria nor Marcus had anticipated. Each morning, Marcus would hike up from his cabin to Eleanor's place, where Victoria had taken up residence with Grace. They'd spend the day working through Eleanor's detailed instruction manuals, testing systems, and learning the intricate dance of off-grid mountain living. Victoria discovered she had an aptitude for mechanical systems that surprised them both. Growing up with a father who'd been an engineer before the accident, she'd absorbed more technical knowledge than she'd realized. The solar power system, which had initially seemed impossibly complex, began to make sense as Marcus walked her through Eleanor's meticulous documentation. "The key is understanding the relationship between generation, storage, and consumption," Marcus explained, pointing to Eleanor's hand-drawn diagrams. "You have to think like an accountant, balancing energy income against energy expenses." Victoria nodded, making notes in a composition book she'd started keeping. Grace dozed in her carrier, seemingly content with the constant low-level hum of activity around her. "So, on cloudy days, I need to reduce consumption to stretch the battery reserves." Exactly. Eleanor calculated that the system could run essential functions for 5 days without sun, but only if you're careful about non-essential power draws. They moved on to the water system, which proved more complex than Victoria had expected. Eleanor had engineered multiple redundancies: rainwater collection, snowmelt channels, a hand-dug well, and emergency purification methods. Each source required different maintenance schedules and had different seasonal considerations. "Water is life up here," Marcus said, showing Victoria how to test the various filtration stages. "You can survive weeks without food, but only days without clean water." Eleanor learned that lesson the hard way during her second winter when her main line froze. Victoria practiced testing water quality with Eleanor's chemical kits, learning to identify signs of contamination or system failure. The complexity was daunting, but Marcus's patient instruction helped her grasp the underlying principles. "You're learning faster than I expected," he admitted one afternoon, as Victoria successfully diagnosed a minor pressure problem in the water system. "Eleanor's documentation is excellent, but it still takes intelligence and intuition to apply it." The compliment warmed Victoria more than she cared to admit. Over the past weeks, she'd found herself looking forward to Marcus's arrival each morning, not just for the instruction, but for his quiet presence. Grace seemed to enjoy his company too, often settling more easily when he was around. "Tell me about Eleanor's first years here," Victoria said, as they worked on calibrating the weather monitoring equipment. You mentioned she made mistakes. Marcus's expression grew thoughtful. Eleanor was brilliant but stubborn. She arrived here in late spring thinking she had plenty of time to prepare for winter, but mountain seasons don't follow lowland schedules. By October, she was trapped by early snow with inadequate food stores and heating systems she didn't fully understand. How did she survive? Sheer determination and a lot of luck. She rationed food down to starvation levels, burned furniture to stay warm, and melted snow for water when her pipes froze. By spring, she'd lost 30 pounds and nearly died of pneumonia. Victoria shuddered, imagining herself in Eleanor's position with a baby to protect. But she stayed. She stayed. And she spent the next summer completely redesigning her systems. That's when she started the detailed record-keeping, the redundant safety measures, the careful planning for every possible failure mode. Victoria studied Eleanor's weather logs, noting how they became more sophisticated over the years. Early entries were simple temperature and precipitation records, but later volumes included barometric pressure trends, wind patterns, and detailed storm predictions. She turned herself into a meteorologist, Victoria observed. She had to. Up here, weather isn't just inconvenience. It's a matter of life and death. Eleanor could predict storms 3 days out better than the National Weather Service. As they worked, Grace began requiring more attention. At 3 weeks old, she was developing a personality, becoming more alert during the day and more demanding of interaction. Victoria found herself constantly multitasking, learning critical survival skills while managing the needs of a newborn. "This is harder than I thought it would be," she admitted one evening as she struggled to balance Grace while reviewing Eleanor's food preservation notes. Marcus looked up from the maintenance checklist he was updating. "Having second thoughts?" "No. I didn't anticipate how much mental energy the baby would require. I feel like I'm always divided between taking care of her and learning what I need to know." Marcus was quiet for a moment, then reached for Grace. "May I?" Victoria hesitated, then handed over the baby. Marcus held Grace with surprising confidence, supporting her head properly and speaking to her in low, gentle tones. The baby gazed up at him with wide eyes, seemingly fascinated by his bearded face. "You're good with her," Victoria said, feeling a complex mix of emotions as she watched them together. "I had practice," Marcus replied simply, not taking his eyes off Grace. Jake and Sam were easier babies than most, but they still required constant attention. Victoria saw pain flicker across his features and realized this was the first time he'd held a baby since losing his sons. The trust implicit in the moment, her willingness to share Grace, his willingness to risk the emotional connection, felt significant. "You don't have to," she began. "I know." Marcus's voice was soft. "But maybe it's time I stopped running from everything that reminds me of what I lost." Grace made a small sound of contentment, and Marcus's expression softened in a way Victoria had never seen before. For a few minutes, they sat in comfortable silence, the baby serving as a bridge between Marcus's carefully guarded past and the uncertain future they were building together. "We should talk about what happens when winter comes," Marcus said eventually, still holding Grace. "The learning curve changes dramatically when you're dealing with sub-zero temperatures and potential isolation for weeks at a time. Eleanor's records show she sometimes went 2 months without leaving the property. That's normal. When the snow gets deep enough, hiking becomes impossible and even emergency services can't reach you. You have to be completely self-sufficient." Victoria felt a chill that had nothing to do with the mountain air. What if Grace gets sick? What if I get injured? Those are the risks you have to weigh. Eleanor chose to accept them, but she was only responsible for herself. Did she ever regret it, living alone up here? Marcus considered the question carefully. "I think she had moments of loneliness, especially as she got older, but she also had a deep satisfaction in her independence. She'd created something remarkable, a life entirely on her own terms. Is that what you found here? A life on your own terms? Marcus looked at her then, and Victoria saw something shift in his expression. I found a place where I couldn't hurt anyone else by failing them. I'm not sure that's the same thing. But you haven't failed me or Grace. You've done exactly what I asked, taught us to take care of ourselves. We're not through the hardest tests yet. That night, as Victoria lay in Eleanor's comfortable bed with Grace sleeping beside her, she thought about Marcus's words. The hardest tests. She knew he was referring to winter survival, but she sensed he was also thinking about the emotional challenges ahead. Over the past weeks, she'd watched Marcus gradually lower his guard. He still maintained careful boundaries, but his interactions with both her and Grace had become warmer, more natural. Sometimes she caught him watching Grace, with an expression of such gentle longing that it made her heart ache for what he'd lost. The next morning brought their first real test. Victoria woke to find the cabin significantly colder than usual, and when she checked the heating system, she discovered the wood stove had gone out during the night. More concerning, the backup propane heater wasn't responding to the thermostat. When Marcus arrived an hour later, he found Victoria in the workshop consulting Eleanor's maintenance manuals while Grace fussed in her carrier. "What's the situation?" he asked, noting the urgency in her movements. "Primary heat source failed overnight. Backup isn't responding. I've been trying to trace the problem through Eleanor's troubleshooting guides." Marcus nodded approvingly. "Good. Walk me through your diagnostic process." Victoria explained her methodology, showing him the tests she'd run and the conclusions she'd reached. Marcus listened without interrupting, occasionally asking clarifying questions. "So, what's your assessment?" he asked when she finished. "I think there's a blockage in the propane line, probably moisture that froze overnight. The solution should be to disconnect the line, clear the blockage, and reconnect with fresh thread sealant." "That's exactly right. Can you do the repair?" Victoria felt a surge of confidence. "Yes, but I'll need to get the propane flowing again before Grace gets too cold." "Then let's get to work." The repair took 2 hours, but Victoria handled it with growing confidence. Marcus supervised, but let her do all the actual work, intervening only when safety required it. When the heater finally kicked on, filling the cabin with blessed warmth, Victoria felt a pride she hadn't experienced since her teaching days. "That was a real test," Marcus said, as they cleaned up the tools. Eleanor faced that same problem, at least a dozen times over the years. It's the kind of thing that could be deadly if you didn't know how to handle it. But I did know how to handle it. You did. And you kept your head under pressure, which is just as important as technical knowledge. That afternoon, as they continued working through Eleanor's systems, Victoria realized something had shifted in their dynamic. Marcus was no longer treating her as a student who might not be capable of this life. He was treating her as someone who was genuinely learning to master it. "I've been thinking about our arrangement," Marcus said, as they reviewed Eleanor's winter preparation checklist. "About what happens when you're ready to be on your own up here." Victoria felt a sudden stab of anxiety. "Are you having second thoughts about teaching me?" "No, but I'm having second thoughts about the timeline. I originally thought we'd spend a few months getting you ready, then I'd return to my mountain and leave you to it. But I'm starting to think that's not realistic." "What do you mean?" Marcus gestured toward Grace, who was awake and alert in her carrier, watching the world around her with increasing curiosity. "You're not just learning to survive up here. You're learning to raise a child in this environment. That's a different challenge entirely, one that changes as she grows." "So, what are you suggesting?" Marcus was quiet for a long moment, and Victoria could see him wrestling with the implications of what he was about to say. "I'm suggesting that maybe complete isolation isn't the answer for either of us. Maybe what Eleanor built here was meant to be shared, not just preserved. Victoria felt her heart skip a beat. Marcus, are you saying... I'm saying that maybe it's time for both of us to stop running from the possibility of caring about other people. Maybe it's time to build something new together. Victoria's hands trembled as she set down her coffee cup, Marcus's words echoing in the suddenly quiet cabin. Grace gurgled contentedly from her carrier, oblivious to the weight of the moment that had just passed between the adults. "What exactly are you suggesting?" Victoria asked carefully, afraid to assume too much, but unable to ignore the implications of what Marcus had said. Marcus stood and walked to the window, looking out at the mountain landscape that had been his sanctuary for 7 years. "I'm suggesting that maybe isolation isn't healing for either of us anymore. Maybe what we both need is connection, responsibility, purpose." "But you said taking responsibility for others was exactly what you couldn't do." "I did say that." Marcus had turned back to face her, and Victoria saw a vulnerability in his expression she hadn't witnessed before. "But these past weeks, watching you learn Eleanor's systems, seeing how you handle challenges, taking care of Grace, I'm starting to think I confused responsibility with control." Victoria felt her heart racing, but forced herself to remain calm. "What's the difference? Responsibility is teaching someone to fish. Control is insisting on doing all the fishing yourself to make sure it's done right." Marcus moved back toward his chair, but remained standing. "I couldn't save Rebecca and the boys because I was trying to control an uncontrollable situation. But I can share knowledge, provide support, be part of a community without having to guarantee outcomes." The word community hung in the air between them, loaded with possibilities Victoria hardly dared consider. "What would that look like practically?" she asked. "I'd been thinking about that. Eleanor's cabin is large enough for a family. My cabin could serve as a workshop space, or we could expand Eleanor's setup. We could work together to improve both properties, make them more sustainable, maybe even productive enough to generate some income." Victoria's mind raced through the implications. "You're talking about a partnership. I'm talking about..." Marcus paused, searching for words. "I'm talking about two people who've both been running from their past, working together to build something better, not just for survival, but for living." Grace chose that moment to start fussing, and Victoria automatically reached for her, grateful for the distraction as she processed Marcus's proposal. The baby settled against her chest, and Victoria found herself thinking about what it would mean for Grace to grow up with Marcus as a steady presence in her life. "There's something else we need to discuss," Marcus continued, his voice taking on a more serious tone. "If we're going to do this, really commit to building a life together up here, we need to be honest about what that means in practical terms." "What do you mean?" "I mean that in the eyes of the law, you're a single mother with no established income, living in an isolated location with a man who has no legal connection to your child. If social services ever got involved, that could create problems." Victoria felt a chill that had nothing to do with the mountain air. She'd been so focused on the immediate challenges of survival and learning that she hadn't considered the broader legal implications of their arrangement. "Are you saying we'd need to make it official somehow?" Marcus ran a hand through his hair, clearly uncomfortable with the direction of the conversation. "I'm saying that if we're going to build a life together, we need to think about how to protect that life from outside interference. There are practical considerations we can't ignore." Victoria understood what he was suggesting without him having to say it explicitly. Marriage would provide legal protections for both her and Grace, would legitimize their unconventional living arrangement in the eyes of any officials who might question it. "That's very practical thinking," she said carefully. "It would be a practical arrangement," Marcus agreed quickly. "Legal protection, shared resources, better security for everyone involved. Nothing more complicated than that." Victoria studied his face, noting the careful way he avoided meeting her eyes. "Is that all it would be?" Marcus was quiet for a long moment. "I don't know," he said finally. "I know I care about you and Grace more than I intended to. I know I look forward to my mornings here, that I've been happier these past weeks than I've been in years. But I also know I'm still carrying grief and guilt that might never fully heal." "I'm not asking you to be healed," Victoria said softly. "I'm asking if you think we could be happy together, even with our respective baggage." "I think," Marcus said slowly, "that maybe happiness isn't about having perfect circumstances. Maybe it's about finding people worth building something with, even when the foundation isn't ideal." Grace had fallen asleep against Victoria's chest, her tiny face peaceful and trusting. Victoria looked down at her daughter, thinking about the future she wanted to create for her. "I want Grace to grow up knowing she's safe and loved," she said. "I want her to have opportunities I never had, to be independent, confident, connected to something bigger than herself. Living here, learning from Eleanor's example, being part of this mountain community, that could give her all of that. And what do you want for yourself?" Victoria considered the question honestly. "I want to matter. I want to contribute something meaningful, to be part of something that lasts. Teaching was supposed to be that, but it turned out to be just another way for other people to control my choices. And you think this life would be different? I think this life would be ours. Whatever we built, whatever we accomplished, would be because we chose it and worked for it together." Marcus nodded slowly. "There's something appealing about that idea." They spent the rest of the morning discussing practical details, mapping out how their partnership might work. Marcus had savings from his previous life that he'd barely touched during his years of isolation. Victoria had her small inheritance and the value of Eleanor's property. Together, they could invest in improvements, maybe even develop some kind of sustainable income from the mountain properties. "Eleanor used to talk about the old mining claims up here," Marcus said as they reviewed topographical maps. "Some of them might still have value, not for large-scale mining, but for small-scale gemstone or mineral extraction. She found some promising samples over the years." "Could that actually generate income?" "Possibly. There's a market for artisanal minerals, especially if they come with a good story. Ethically sourced from a sustainable mountain homestead has appealed to certain buyers." Victoria found herself getting excited about the possibilities. What about tourism? People pay good money for authentic experiences, especially ones that include education about sustainable living. Eleanor's place could certainly serve as a demonstration site. We'd have to be careful about privacy and security, but selective tours might work. As they talked, Victoria realized they were no longer discussing whether to build a life together, but how to do it successfully. The shift felt natural, inevitable, as if they'd been moving toward this decision since the night Grace was born. "There's one more thing we need to talk about," Marcus said as afternoon shadows began lengthening across the cabin. "If we do this, if we commit to building something together, we need to be clear about what happens if it doesn't work out." Victoria felt a stab of anxiety. "Are you having second thoughts?" "No, but I'm thinking practically. We're both carrying emotional baggage that could complicate things. We need to have a plan for protecting Grace's interests, no matter what happens between us." The suggestion was logical, but it also highlighted the careful distance Marcus still maintained, even as they discussed a future together. Victoria wondered if he would ever fully let down his guard, or if she would always be navigating around the walls he'd built to protect himself. "What kind of protection are you thinking about?" "Legal documents ensure that Grace inherits Eleanor's property, regardless of what happens to our relationship. A trust fund for her education and future needs. Clear agreements about custody and decision-making." Victoria nodded, appreciating his thoughtfulness even as she felt a little hurt by the clinical approach. "You've really thought this through?" "I have to," Marcus said simply. "I failed to protect the people I loved once before. I won't make that mistake again." The reference to his lost family cast a shadow over their planning, reminding Victoria that Marcus's proposal was as much about honoring his past as building their future. She wondered if he would ever love her and Grace the way he'd loved Rebecca and the boys, or if he would always hold something back to protect himself from potential loss. "I understand," she said quietly, "and I appreciate that you're thinking about Grace's welfare. She's going to need stability, educational opportunities, connections to the world beyond these mountains. Even if we're committed to this lifestyle, she should have choices when she grows up." Victoria looked down at Grace, who was waking up and beginning to show signs of hunger. "I want her to have the best of both worlds, the independence and confidence that comes from this kind of upbringing, but also the opportunity to pursue whatever path calls to her. Then we plan for that from the beginning. We make sure this place can support her development without limiting her options." As Victoria prepared to nurse Grace, she reflected on the conversation they'd just had. In the space of a few hours, they'd gone from teacher and student to potential partners in an ambitious life project. The practical aspects felt manageable, even exciting, but the emotional territory remained largely uncharted. "Marcus," she said as he prepared to leave for his evening chores, "are you sure you're ready for this? Not just the practical partnership, but the daily reality of sharing your life with other people again." Marcus paused at the door, his hand on the latch. "No," he said honestly, "but I'm sure I want to try. For the first time in 7 years, I have something to look forward to instead of just something to survive." After he left, Victoria sat in Eleanor's comfortable chair with Grace nursing contentedly, thinking about the future they were planning. The mountains outside the window looked the same as always, but everything felt different now, charged with possibility rather than just challenge. She thought about Eleanor, who had come to these mountains to escape her past and ended up building something remarkable. She thought about Marcus, who had come here to hide from his grief and was now choosing to engage with life again. And she thought about herself, who had come here desperate and alone and was now contemplating a future filled with purpose and connection. Grace finished nursing and looked up at her with bright, alert eyes. "What do you think, little one?" Victoria whispered. "Ready to help us build something amazing?" As if in response, Grace smiled, her first real smile, not just a reflex, but a genuine expression of contentment. Victoria took it as a good sign, a blessing on the extraordinary life they were about to create together in the shadow of the mountains. The first snowfall came in mid-October, 3 weeks earlier than Eleanor's records indicated. Victoria woke to a world transformed. The familiar mountain landscape softened and muffled under 6 inches of pristine white. Grace, now 6 weeks old and much more alert, seemed fascinated by the changed light filtering through the windows. "This is it," Marcus announced when he arrived that morning, his boots leaving dark prints in the snow. "Real winter prep starts now. Everything we've learned so far was just practice." Victoria felt a familiar mix of excitement and anxiety. Over the past month, she and Marcus had fallen into a comfortable routine of shared work and planning. They'd begun the legal process of making their partnership official, a practical marriage that would protect Grace's inheritance and legitimize their unconventional family structure. But the approaching winter would be their first real test as a team. "What's the priority today?" she asked, strapping Grace into her carrier. "Food preservation. Eleanor's root cellar is well stocked, but we need to supplement with fresh protein. There's a deer population that migrates through this area every fall. If we can get one, that's meat for months." Victoria had never hunted before, but she'd been learning to handle firearms as part of her mountain survival education. Marcus had, taught her to shoot accurately with both rifle and pistol, emphasizing that guns were tools, not weapons, in their environment. "You want me to come with you? I want you to take the shot if we get the opportunity. This is part of learning complete self-sufficiency." They spent the morning tracking deer through the snow-covered forest above Eleanor's cabin. Marcus moved, with the quiet confidence of someone who understood wilderness hunting, while Victoria tried to apply the lessons he'd taught her about reading animal signs and moving silently through natural terrain. Grace seemed to enjoy the outdoor adventure, sleeping peacefully in her carrier despite the cold. Victoria had learned to dress her in layers, following Eleanor's detailed notes about protecting infants in extreme weather. "There," Marcus whispered, pointing through the trees. "Two does, maybe 60 yards. Victoria saw them. Elegant creatures, picking their way through the snow, alert but not alarmed. She felt her heart rate increase as she raised the rifle, remembering Marcus's instructions about breathing, sight alignment, and trigger control. "Take your time," Marcus murmured. "Make sure of your shot. Wounding an animal and losing it is worse than missing entirely." Victoria settled the crosshairs on the larger doe, took a deep breath, and squeezed the trigger. The rifle's report echoed through the forest, and the deer dropped immediately. The second doe bounded away, but Victoria's target lay still in the snow. "Clean kill," Marcus said approvingly. "You did well." Victoria felt a complex mix of emotions: pride in her marksmanship, sadness for the life taken, and gratitude for the sustenance it would provide. "How do you handle the feeling of taking a life?" "By honoring it," Marcus replied. "We use every part of this animal. The meat feeds us. The hide provides materials. Even the bones have uses. Nothing is wasted. In the old way of thinking, the deer gives its life so we can live. Our responsibility is to receive that gift properly." Field dressing the deer was a skill Victoria had never imagined needing, but Marcus walked her through the process with patience and practical instruction. It was messy, cold work, but she found herself surprisingly capable of tasks that would have horrified her city-dwelling self just months ago. "You're becoming someone different," Marcus observed as they worked together to prepare the carcass. "For transport, someone Eleanor would recognize. Someone I didn't know I could be," Victoria agreed. "Sometimes I wonder if this person was always inside me, waiting for the right circumstances to emerge." They spent the afternoon processing the deer at Eleanor's cabin, with Marcus teaching Victoria traditional preservation techniques. Some meat went into the freezer, but most was prepared for long-term storage without refrigeration: jerky, pemmican, and canned preparations that would last through the winter and beyond. Eleanor's preservation methods are a combination of Native American techniques and modern food science, Marcus explained as they worked. She studied traditional methods but adapted them using contemporary understanding of food safety. Grace watched from her carrier, seemingly fascinated by the constant activity around her. Victoria had begun talking to her daughter throughout their daily work, narrating what they were doing and why. She wanted Grace to grow up understanding the connection between effort and sustenance, between skill and survival. "Your mama is learning to be a mountain woman," she told Grace as she cut strips of venison for jerky. "Someday you'll learn these skills too, but for now, you just need to grow strong and healthy." As evening approached, Marcus built up the fire and began preparing what he called a celebration meal: fresh venison steaks, wild mushrooms he'd gathered earlier, and vegetables from Eleanor's preserved stores. "What are we celebrating?" Victoria asked, settling into the comfortable rhythm of their shared meal preparation. "Your first successful hunt." Eleanor always said that taking responsibility for your own meat was a crucial step in mountain independence. They ate by firelight, with Grace sleeping peacefully in Victoria's arms. The venison was tender and flavorful, seasoned with herbs Eleanor had grown and dried. Victoria felt a deep satisfaction that came not just from the good food, but from knowing she had provided it herself. "I need to ask you something," Marcus said as they cleaned up after dinner. "About the marriage arrangement we discussed." Victoria felt her stomach tighten. "Are you having second thoughts?" "No, but I've been thinking about timing. Winter is coming fast, and if we're going to make this official, we should do it before we're potentially snowed in for months." "You mean soon?" "I mean next week, if possible. I've contacted a justice of the peace in Millbrook who's willing to come up here. We can handle all the legal paperwork at the same time, property transfers, guardianship documents, everything." Victoria nodded, though she felt a flutter of nervousness. "That makes sense practically." Marcus studied her face in the firelight. "You seem uncertain." "Not uncertain about the decision, just... It feels strange to be planning a wedding that's primarily a legal arrangement, even a practical one. Would you prefer something more traditional?" Victoria considered this. "I think I'd prefer something that acknowledges what we're actually doing, two people choosing to build a life together, to take care of each other and Grace. Not romantic fantasy, but not just paperwork either." Marcus was quiet for a moment. "What would that look like?" "I don't know. Maybe writing our own vows that reflect our actual situation and commitments. Maybe having the ceremony here, in Eleanor's cabin, where we've been building this partnership." "I'd like that," Marcus said simply. "Something honest about what we're promising each other." They spent the evening drafting simple vows that reflected their practical commitment while acknowledging the deeper connection that had developed between them. Victoria found herself surprised by how much she had to say about their partnership, about the respect and affection that had grown alongside their shared work. "I promise to share the work of building this life," she wrote, "to learn from you and teach you in return, to honor Eleanor's legacy while creating something new, to be a partner you can depend on in good times and difficult ones." Marcus's vows were more concise, but equally heartfelt. "I promise to use my knowledge to keep you and Grace safe, to trust you with responsibility instead of trying to control outcomes, to build something lasting together, whatever comes." The next morning brought news that changed their timeline unexpectedly. Marcus returned from a supply run to Millbrook with concerning information. "There's a storm system coming," he announced, spreading weather maps across Eleanor's kitchen table. "Potentially the worst early-season storm in decades. We have maybe 3 days before it hits." Victoria studied the meteorological data, applying the weather prediction skills Marcus had been teaching her. The satellite images showed a massive system building in the Pacific Northwest, pulling Arctic air down from Canada and moisture up from the Gulf of Mexico. "How much snow are we talking about?" "Possibly 4 feet or more. High winds, sub-zero temperatures, potential power outages even in the valleys. If this hits as predicted, we could be completely isolated for weeks." Victoria felt a chill that had nothing to do with the approaching weather. "What does this mean for our plans?" "It means we accelerate everything. Wedding ceremony tomorrow, if the Justice of the Peace can make it. Final winterization of both cabins. Emergency supplies. Move to redundant locations. We need to be prepared for the possibility that we won't be able to travel between properties for an extended period." The next 24 hours passed in a blur of intense preparation. The Justice of the Peace, a practical woman named Judge Martinez, who had handled unusual mountain weddings before, arrived early and conducted a brief but meaningful ceremony in Eleanor's living room. Victoria wore a simple dress she'd found among Eleanor's belongings, Marcus wore his cleanest flannel shirt, and Grace served as an alert and interested witness. "By the power vested in me by the state of Colorado," Judge Martinez concluded, "I now pronounce you husband and wife. You may kiss the bride if you're so inclined." Marcus and Victoria looked at each other for a moment that felt suspended in time. Then Marcus stepped forward and kissed her gently, a gesture that felt both ceremonial and genuinely affectionate. "Welcome to the family, Grace," Judge Martinez said, gently touching the baby's cheek before gathering her legal documents and heading back down the mountain ahead of the storm. That evening, as the first bands of snow began falling and the wind picked up ominously, Victoria and Marcus worked together to secure both cabins for the siege ahead. They moved emergency supplies to multiple locations, tested backup systems, and prepared for what could be weeks of complete isolation. "Are you ready for this?" Marcus asked, as they made final checks on Eleanor's heating system. Victoria looked around the cabin that had become her home, at Grace sleeping peacefully in her carrier, at Marcus, whose presence had transformed from stranger to teacher to partner. Outside, the storm was building toward what promised to be an epic test of everything they'd learned and built together. "I'm ready," she said, and meant it completely. As the blizzard intensified outside, Victoria felt a deep sense of satisfaction. They had food, fuel, shelter, and each other. They had skills, knowledge, and the determination to use both. Most importantly, they had created something worth protecting, a family, a home, a life built on their own terms in the shadow of the mountains. The storm could come. They were ready to meet it together. The storm arrived with a fury that surpassed even Eleanor's most dire weather records. For 3 days and nights, the wind howled around the cabin with a sound like freight trains, driving snow so thick that Victoria couldn't see the workshop building just 50 feet away. The temperature plummeted to 20 below zero, and the snow piled up against the windows until the cabin felt like a cocoon buried in the mountain. On the second day, the power went out. "Solar panels are completely covered," Marcus reported after checking the electrical systems. "We're running on battery reserves now, but they won't last long in this cold." Victoria adjusted Grace's blankets and moved closer to the wood stove, which had become the center of their world. "How long can we maintain heat without electricity?" "As long as we have wood and can keep the stove running. The problem is that if the chimney gets blocked by snow or ice, we're in serious trouble." They established a routine that revolved around survival basics, keeping the fire burning, melting snow for water, rationing food and fuel. Grace seemed to sense the tension in the air, sleeping more than usual and requiring constant attention to stay warm enough. "She's so small," Victoria worried aloud as she checked Grace's temperature for the dozenth time that day. "What if she gets hypothermia?" "She won't," Marcus said firmly. "We'll keep her warm and dry. Babies are tougher than you think. And she has 2 parents who won't let anything happen to her." The word parents hung in the air between them. In the 3 days since their wedding, the reality of their new family structure had been overshadowed by storm preparation and survival concerns. But now, trapped together in the cabin with nothing but time and each other, the deeper implications of their commitment were becoming clear. "Tell me about Jake and Sam," Victoria said quietly as they sat by the fire on the 3rd night. "What were they like?" Marcus was quiet for so long that Victoria thought he wouldn't answer. When he finally spoke, his voice was soft with remembered affection. Jake was the leader even though they were twins. He was always planning adventures, talking Sam into climbing higher trees or exploring farther from the house. Sam was gentler, more thoughtful. He'd spend hours drawing pictures or building elaborate structures with blocks. "They sound wonderful." They were. Marcus poked at the fire, sending sparks up the chimney. Jake would have loved this place, the freedom, the adventure of living off the grid. Sam would have appreciated Eleanor's engineering, the way every system has a purpose and a backup. Victoria shifted Grace to her other arm, thinking about the boys Marcus had lost and the daughter she was raising. "Do you think they would have approved of Grace?" Marcus looked at the baby in Victoria's arms, and his expression softened. "I think they would have been fascinated by her. Jake would have wanted to teach her everything he knew, and Sam would have been protective, like a big brother." And Rebecca? Marcus's face tightened slightly. Rebecca wanted more children. She would have been happy that I found my way back to being part of a family, even if it's not the family we planned. The storm finally began to weaken on the fourth day, but the aftermath presented new challenges. When Marcus was able to dig his way out of the cabin, they discovered that the snow had drifted to over 5 feet in some places, completely blocking the path to his own cabin and making travel between buildings treacherous. "We're going to be living in close quarters for a while," Marcus announced as he worked to clear the solar panels. "It could be weeks before I can get back to my place safely." Victoria felt a flutter of nervousness mixed with anticipation. Their marriage had been practical so far, conducted for legal protection and convenience. But sharing the intimate space of Eleanor's cabin, caring for Grace together, depending on each other for survival, that was creating something deeper and more complicated. "The guest room is yours for as long as you need it," she said, trying to keep her voice neutral. Marcus met her eyes. "Thank you. I know this isn't what either of us planned when we discussed the marriage arrangement." "No, but maybe it's what we need. A chance to really understand what we're committing to." That evening, as they worked together to prepare dinner, from their stored supplies, Victoria found herself paying attention to the small, domestic details of their shared life. The way Marcus automatically handed her utensils before she asked for them, how he instinctively moved to support her when she stood up with Grace, the comfortable silence that had developed between them as they worked. "We're getting good at this," she observed. "At what?" "Being a team, being a family." Marcus paused in his stirring of the stew they were preparing. "It feels natural, doesn't it? More natural than I expected. More natural than I was afraid it would be," Victoria admitted. "I've been independent for so long, I wasn't sure I could adapt to partnership." "Independence doesn't have to mean isolation," Marcus said. "Eleanor taught me that. She was completely self-sufficient, but she also valued connection when it was genuine." They ate dinner by candlelight to conserve battery power, with Grace awake and alert in her carrier, watching the adults with increasing curiosity. At 2 months old, she was beginning to show more personality, smiling responsively, tracking movement with her eyes, making sounds that seemed almost conversational. "She's trying to tell us something," Victoria said as Grace made a series of elaborate cooing sounds. "Probably complaining about the accommodations," Marcus replied, making Grace laugh, a sound that delighted both adults. "That's the first time I've heard you make a joke," Victoria realized. Marcus looked surprised. "I used to have a sense of humor before. I'd forgotten about that." "What else have you forgotten?" Marcus considered the question seriously. "How to hope for things, how to plan for a future that included other people, how to believe that good things could last." Victoria felt her heart clench with sympathy. "And now?" "Now I'm remembering. Slowly, but I'm remembering." Later that night, as they prepared for bed in their respective rooms, Victoria found herself thinking about the transformation she'd witnessed in Marcus over the past months. The guarded, wounded man who delivered Grace in his mountain cabin was slowly revealing someone warmer, more open, more willing to engage with life. She was settling Grace for the night when she heard Marcus cry out from the guest room, a sound of distress that brought her immediately to his door. "Marcus, are you okay?" "Nightmare," he said hoarsely. "Sorry, I didn't mean to wake you." Victoria hesitated for a moment, then pushed open the door. Marcus was sitting on the edge of the bed, his head in his hands, clearly shaken. "The accident?" she asked softly. He nodded without looking up. "I dream about it sometimes, different versions where I make different choices. But they always end the same way." Victoria sat down beside him on the bed, careful not to invade his space, but offering her presence. "Do you want to talk about it?" "I keep thinking about what Jake would be like now. He'd be 11, probably tall for his age, like his mother. Sam would be quieter, more serious, but just as tall. They'd be old enough to help with the mountain work, to understand why I chose this life. They'd be proud of you, Victoria said quietly, for surviving, for learning to care about people again, for helping Grace and me. Marcus looked at her then, and Victoria saw tears in his eyes. How can you be sure? Because I'm proud of you. Because Grace is going to grow up knowing that when her mother needed help, you were there. Because you've shown me what it means to be strong enough to start over. Something shifted in Marcus's expression, and Victoria realized they were sitting very close together on the narrow bed. The intimacy of the moment, the darkness, the shared vulnerability, the growing connection between them, created a tension that neither of them had acknowledged before. Victoria, Marcus said softly, this isn't just a practical arrangement anymore, is it? No, she whispered. It's not. He reached out and touched her face gently, and Victoria felt her heart rate accelerate. I didn't expect to feel this way again. Didn't think I was capable of it. What way? Like I want to protect you, not just because it's my responsibility, but because I care about you. Like I want to wake up next to you every morning. Like I want to be Grace's father, not just her legal guardian. Victoria felt tears prick her eyes. I've been hoping you might feel that way, but I was afraid to assume. I've been afraid too. Afraid that caring about you means risking the kind of loss I barely survived before. And now? Marcus leaned forward and kissed her, gently at first, then with growing warmth and conviction. When they broke apart, he rested his forehead against hers. Now I think maybe the risk is worth it, maybe love is worth it, even when you can't guarantee the outcome. Victoria felt something inside her chest expand with joy and hope. I love you too, Marcus. I didn't plan to, but I do. They held each other in the darkness, listening to the wind still howling outside, and Grace's peaceful breathing from the other room. The storm had forced them together physically, but it had also created the intimacy necessary for them to acknowledge what had been growing between them emotionally. What happens now? Victoria asked. Now we stop pretending this is just a practical arrangement, Marcus said. Now we build a real marriage, a real family, a real life together. Are you sure you're ready for that? Marcus pulled back to look at her, and Victoria saw certainty in his expression that hadn't been there before. I'm sure I want to try, with you, with Grace, in this place Eleanor built. I want to create something lasting. Victoria kissed him again, deeper this time, and felt the last of her own walls crumble. She'd come to these mountains desperate and alone, driven by circumstances beyond her control. But she was choosing to stay, choosing to love, choosing to build something extraordinary with a man who understood both loss and hope. Outside, the storm continued to rage, but inside Eleanor's cabin, 3 people who had found each other against all odds were creating their own shelter against the world's uncertainties. They had survived the worst the mountain could throw at them, and they had discovered that survival was only the beginning of what they could accomplish together. 1 year later, Victoria stood on the porch of Eleanor's cabin, now their home, watching Grace take her first tentative steps across the wooden floor. At 14 months old, her daughter had grown into a confident, curious toddler who treated the mountain wilderness as her personal playground. "Mama, up!" Grace demanded, reaching her arms toward Victoria with the imperious tone of someone accustomed to being the center of attention. Victoria scooped up her daughter, marveling at how much had changed since that desperate night when Grace had been born in Marcus's isolated cabin. The baby who had entered the world during a crisis had grown into a healthy, happy child who knew nothing but love and security. "Where's Daddy?" Victoria asked, using the title that had evolved naturally over the months. Marcus had never pushed for it, but Grace had begun calling him Dada around her first birthday, and the name had stuck. "Daddy mine!" Grace announced, pointing toward the workshop where Marcus was putting finishing touches on a custom jewelry piece, part of their growing artisanal mining business. The past year had been filled with challenges and triumphs. They'd weathered 2 more significant storms, learned to work together in ways neither had anticipated, and slowly built a life that balanced Eleanor's legacy with their own innovations. The abandoned ghost town of Silverton Ridge had become something entirely different, not a place of endings, but of new beginnings. Victoria walked down to the workshop, Grace babbling happily in her arms. Through the window, she could see Marcus, bent over his workbench, using Eleanor's old tools to craft silver jewelry embedded with gemstones they'd extracted from the mountain claims. His beard was longer now, streaked with more grey, but his movements were confident and purposeful in ways they hadn't been when she'd first met him. "How's the anniversary commission coming?" Victoria asked, entering the workshop. Marcus looked up, his face lighting up with the smile that still made Victoria's heart skip a beat. "Finished this morning. The couple is going to love it." He held up a matched set of silver rings, each embedded with small garnets they'd found in Eleanor's old mining tunnel. The craftsmanship was exquisite, but more than that, the pieces told a story about finding precious things in unexpected places, about creating beauty from raw materials, about commitment that grows stronger under pressure. "They're beautiful," Victoria said, meaning it. "Eleanor would be proud of what you've done with her equipment." "What we've done," Marcus corrected. "You're the one who figured out the market strategy, set up the online presence, handles all the customer communications." Their business had grown organically from Marcus's initial experiments with Eleanor's mining equipment. What started as a way to generate modest income had evolved into a thriving artisanal jewelry operation that attracted customers from across the country. People were drawn not just to the quality of the work, but to the story behind it. The Mountain family creating beautiful things in a place that most people considered uninhabitable. "Speaking of customers," Victoria said, "we have visitors arriving this afternoon for the Sunset Tour." They'd begun offering limited ecotourism experiences the previous summer, carefully curated tours that showed visitors Eleanor's sustainable living systems while teaching basic wilderness skills. The tours were intentionally small, never more than 6 people at a time, and focused on education rather than entertainment. "The family from Portland?" "Yes, and they're bringing their teenage daughter. She's interested in sustainable agriculture. Wants to see Eleanor's garden systems." Marcus grinned. "Another convert to mountain life." "Maybe, though I'm not sure her parents are ready for that level of commitment." Grace squirmed to be put down, and Victoria set her on the workshop floor, where she immediately began investigating the fascinating array of tools and materials within her reach. Marcus automatically moved anything potentially dangerous out of her grasp while continuing their conversation. "Any word from Sarah?" he asked. Victoria's relationship with her sister had evolved over the past year. Initially horrified by Victoria's decision to marry a stranger and live in the mountains, Sarah had gradually come to accept and even admire the life her sister had built. She visited every summer, bringing her own children to experience what she called Aunt Victoria's adventure. She's planning to bring the kids for 2 weeks this summer instead of 1. Tom needs to see what real self-sufficiency looks like. "And your students from the teacher exchange program?" Victoria had begun hosting urban teachers for week-long immersions in mountain living, sharing Eleanor's sustainable systems while helping educators understand different approaches to child development. The program had grown from a single visitor to a waiting list of teachers wanting to experience alternative education models. 3 more applications this week. "I think we might need to expand the guest facilities." Marcus picked up Grace, who had managed to reach a particularly interesting piece of raw silver. "Oh, what do you think, little mountain woman? Should we build a bigger guest house?" Grace clapped her hands enthusiastically. "Big house! I'll take that as a yes," Victoria laughed. They walked back to the main cabin together, Grace chattering in the mixture of real words and creative language that had become her trademark. The path between buildings was well worn now, lined with solar lights Marcus had installed for safety and convenience. Eleanor's original setup had been expanded and refined, but always with respect for her underlying principles of sustainability and self-sufficiency. As they approached the cabin, Victoria saw their afternoon visitors hiking up the trail from the parking area they'd established at the ghost town's edge. The Portland family looked exactly as she'd expected. Outdoor enthusiasts with high-quality gear and the slightly overwhelmed expressions of people encountering true wilderness for the first time. "Welcome to Silverton Ridge," Victoria called, out as they reached the cabin. "I'm Victoria, this is Marcus, and this is our daughter Grace." The family introduced themselves, David and Jennifer Morrison, with their 15-year-old daughter Emma. Emma immediately gravitated toward Grace, who was always delighted to have new people to charm. "This is incredible," Jennifer said, looking around at the mountain vista. "I had no idea places like this still existed." "Eleanor Carmichael lived here for 50 years, Victoria explained as she led them toward the cabin. "She built all of this from scratch, creating a completely sustainable mountain homestead. We're just the current caretakers of her vision." The tour that followed had become second nature to Victoria, but she still felt Eleanor's presence strongly. As she explained each system, each innovation, each solution to the challenges of mountain living, the Morrisons were fascinated by everything. The solar power setup, the water collection and purification systems, the food preservation techniques, the workshop where Marcus created his jewelry. "How do you handle medical emergencies?" David asked the practical question that every visitor eventually raised. "Helicopter evacuation is possible in good weather," Marcus replied. "But mostly, we've learned to prevent problems rather than treat them. Good nutrition, regular exercise, careful attention to safety protocols. Victoria has advanced first aid training, and I maintain my paramedic certification." "What about Grace's education?" Emma asked. "Does she go to school?" Victoria smiled. "Grace is learning constantly. She knows the names of every bird and animal on the mountain, understands basic weather patterns, can identify edible plants. Traditional academics will come later, but she's already developing critical thinking skills and practical knowledge that most children never acquire." As the afternoon progressed, Victoria watched Emma's fascination grow. The teenager asked increasingly sophisticated questions about sustainable living, renewable energy, and alternative education models. Victoria recognized the spark of someone encountering possibilities they'd never imagined. "Have you ever considered taking on apprentices?" Emma asked as they concluded the tour. "I mean someone who wanted to learn this lifestyle seriously?" Victoria and Marcus exchanged glances. They'd discussed the possibility of expanding their educational mission, but hadn't made any definitive decisions. "That's an interesting idea," Marcus said carefully. "What did you have in mind?" "I'm going to be a senior next year, and I've already been accepted to Portland State for environmental studies. But honestly, what you're doing here seems more real than anything I'd learn in a classroom." Jennifer Morrison looked alarmed. "Emma, we're not moving to the mountains." "I'm not asking you to," Emma replied with teenage directness. "I'm asking if I could spend my gap year here, learning from Victoria and Marcus. Real sustainability, real self-sufficiency, real alternative education." Victoria felt a familiar flutter of excitement mixed with apprehension. Taking on a long-term apprentice would be a significant commitment, but it also represented a natural evolution of Eleanor's legacy. That would be a serious undertaking, she said. Mountain living isn't romantic. It's demanding, sometimes dangerous, always requiring complete commitment. I understand that, Emma said. I've been reading about homesteading and sustainable living for years. I know it's hard work. That's what makes it meaningful. David Morrison shook his head. Emma, you're 17 years old. You don't know what you're asking. I know exactly what I'm asking, Emma replied with quiet determination. I'm asking to learn something real. Victoria saw herself in Emma's earnestness, remembering her own desperate flight from conventional expectations. The circumstances were different, but the desire for authenticity, for a life of genuine purpose, was unmistakable. Let's talk about this seriously, Marcus said. If you're genuinely interested, we could design a structured apprenticeship program. 6 months to start, with clear learning objectives and safety protocols. Your parents would need to be fully supportive, and you'd need to demonstrate real commitment to the physical and mental demands. The conversation continued for another hour, covering practical details, safety considerations, and educational objectives. By the time the Morrisons prepared to leave, tentative plans were in place for Emma to return in the fall for a trial period. Think about it carefully, Victoria told Emma as they said goodbye. This isn't an adventure or a break from real life. This is a different kind of real life, one that requires everything you have to give. Emma nodded seriously. I will. Thank you for considering it. As the family disappeared down the mountain trail, Victoria and Marcus sat on the porch watching. The sunset painted the peaks in shades of gold and crimson. Grace played at their feet with a collection of smooth stones Marcus had polished for her. Are we really ready to take on an apprentice? Victoria asked. I think we're ready to take on the responsibility of passing on what we've learned, Marcus replied. Eleanor taught me that knowledge is only valuable if it's shared. Victoria nodded, thinking about the year they'd just completed and the years ahead. They'd built something remarkable together, not just a sustainable homestead, but a genuine family, a thriving business, and a model for alternative living that was attracting attention from people seeking more meaningful lives. I never imagined this when I was driving up that mountain road with my car breaking down, she said. I never imagined this when I was hiding from the world in my cabin, Marcus replied. But maybe that's the point. Maybe the best things happen when we stop trying to control outcomes and start being open to possibilities. Grace toddled over to Victoria, holding up a particularly pretty stone. Mama, look! Beautiful, sweetheart, Victoria said, lifting Grace onto her lap. Just like everything else in our life up here. As darkness settled over the mountains and the first stars appeared, Victoria felt a deep contentment that had nothing to do with easy circumstances and everything to do with authentic purpose. They'd created something worth defending, worth sharing, worth passing on to the next generation. The ghost town of Silverton Ridge would never be the same bustling community it once was, but it had become something perhaps more valuable, a place where people could discover what they were truly capable of, where love could grow in the most unlikely circumstances, where the abandoned could become the foundation for something entirely new. Grace fell asleep in Victoria's arms as the mountain. Night embraced them, and Victoria looked ahead to tomorrow with anticipation rather than anxiety. There would be challenges, there always were, but they would meet them together as a family, as partners, as people who had learned that the greatest adventures begin when you finally stop running from life and start building it instead. Up. Next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hits the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any. Upload from us.